The most dangerous people in prison are rarely the loudest. They're usually the ones everyone mistakes for harmless. The first warning came long before anyone noticed the old man. It came in the way conversations faded whenever the heavy steel door leading to the shower block rolled open. Inside Blackstone State Penitentiary, silence carried meaning. It could signal respect, fear, or the quiet expectation that someone was about to make a mistake they couldn't take back. On that cold Tuesday morning, the air inside D Block smelled of damp concrete, industrial soap, and rusted pipes that had been running for decades. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a tired hum, casting pale reflections across rows of wet tile. Inmates moved through the corridor with practiced routines, some carrying towels over their shoulders, others avoiding eye contact, as if looking at the wrong person for 1 second too long could change the course of their day. The shower room sat at the end of the hallway behind a thick metal door scarred by years of scratches and chipped paint. Everyone knew the unwritten rules of that place. Cameras watched the entrance, but never every corner. Guards checked in often enough to discourage obvious trouble, but not often enough to see everything. It was where pride was tested, reputations were built, and sometimes destroyed without a single official report being filed. That morning, a group of 6 white inmates arrived together, laughing louder than necessary. At the center walked Travis Coleman, a broad-shouldered man whose confidence seemed to fill every inch of the hallway before he did. He didn't need to raise his voice to remind people who controlled D Block. His presence alone caused smaller conversations to stop. Several inmates quietly stepped aside, pretending to reorganize lockers or retie worn sneakers that didn't need tying. Nobody wanted to be noticed when Travis was looking for entertainment. He wasn't searching for a fight. He was searching for someone who looked incapable of saying no. Then the old man appeared. He walked slowly, carrying a folded gray towel beneath his remaining left arm. His prison uniform hung loosely over a lean frame shaped more by discipline than age. His right sleeve was neatly pinned where his arm had once been, showing no attempt to hide what life had already taken from him. His dark skin contrasted against the faded orange fabric, while streaks of silver lined his closely trimmed hair. He kept his eyes forward, his breathing steady, his footsteps measured with the kind of balance that seemed almost effortless despite every reason it shouldn't have been. His name was Elias Washington. According to the paperwork, he was 72 years old. According to the rumors, he kept to himself, never complained, never borrowed anything, never owed anyone favors, and never spoke unless someone spoke to him first. Most inmates barely noticed him during his first week inside Blackstone. Those who did assumed he wouldn't last long in D Block. An elderly black inmate with only one arm seemed like the easiest target imaginable. Travis noticed him immediately. A grin spread across his face as he slowed his pace. One of the younger gang members leaned closer and whispered something that made the others laugh. Their voices echoed across the damp hallway, drawing curious glances from every direction. Elias continued walking without changing speed. He neither hurried nor hesitated. It was as though the laughter belonged to another world entirely. That calm unsettled more than one observer. Near the laundry carts, an older inmate named Raymond Brewer quietly lowered his eyes the moment he recognized Elias approaching the shower entrance. Raymond had spent nearly 25 years moving through prisons across 3 states. He had seen ambitious gang leaders rise and disappear. He had watched men build terrifying reputations only to lose them overnight. Yet the expression crossing his weathered face now wasn't curiosity. It was concern, not for Elias, for everyone standing in his path. Raymond turned away so quickly that the younger inmate beside him frowned in confusion. "You okay?" the young man whispered. Raymond answered without lifting his head. "Just don't watch." The younger inmate laughed, assuming the old-timer had simply grown tired of prison drama. He didn't understand why Raymond suddenly stepped back until his shoulders touched the concrete wall, creating as much distance as possible between himself and the entrance to the showers. Across the corridor, another inmate quietly picked up his towel and chose a different shower room without saying a word. A third inmate who had been heading toward the same entrance abruptly changed direction. None of them exchanged explanations. None of them needed to. Meanwhile, Travis Coleman planted himself directly in front of the shower entrance. His crew spread out naturally beside him, leaving no obvious path forward. Water continued dripping somewhere deep inside the room beyond the metal door. The hallway gradually emptied as people sensed something unfolding. Elias finally stopped only a few feet away. He looked at the closed doorway for a brief moment before calmly lifting his eyes to meet the men standing between him and the entrance. His expression never changed. No one spoke for several long seconds. The only sound came from water striking the tile somewhere beyond the heavy steel door, each steady drop echoing through the corridor like a clock counting towards something invisible. Travis Coleman studied the old man with open amusement, expecting nervousness, hesitation, or at least the uneasy glance that most newcomers could never hide. Instead, Elias Washington simply waited. His breathing remained slow. His shoulders stayed relaxed. Even with only one arm, his posture carried a quiet balance that was strangely difficult to explain. It was not confidence in the ordinary sense. It was something older, something that seemed completely untouched by the tension filling the hallway. Travis folded his arms across his chest and smiled wider. "Looks like you picked the wrong time to take a shower, old man." A few members of his crew laughed on cue. Another inmate leaned against the wall and shook his head as if he had already seen enough to know how the story would end. Yet the reaction he expected from everyone else never fully arrived. Instead of gathering closer, several inmates slowly drifted farther down the corridor. Nobody announced they were leaving. Nobody warned the younger prisoners to stay back. They simply created distance without drawing attention to themselves. The movement was subtle enough that Travis never noticed. Elias did. His eyes briefly followed the quiet shift before returning to the men standing in front of him. There was no challenge in his expression and no sign of fear. He looked at them the same way someone might study an unexpected rainstorm, accepting that it existed without allowing it to change who he was. Travis interpreted the silence as surrender. "You hear me?" he asked. "This hallway belongs to us until we say otherwise." Elias answered in a calm voice that barely rose above the dripping water. "Hallways belong to whoever walks through them." The words were simple. There was no sarcasm and no attempt to sound clever. Somehow that made them even harder to dismiss. One of the younger gang members frowned. He had expected excuses or pleading. Instead, he found himself looking at an elderly man who sounded as though he were discussing the weather instead of standing in the middle of an obvious confrontation. Travis chuckled and glanced toward his friends. "He thinks he is teaching a class." More laughter followed, but this time it was thinner than before. Something about the old man's tone made the jokes feel strangely incomplete. Down the hallway, Raymond Brewer quietly closed the book he had been pretending to read. He knew that voice, not because he had heard Elias speak often, but because decades earlier he had heard another instructor use that exact kind of calm. It had been during a rehabilitation program inside a federal facility, where visiting martial arts teachers spoke about discipline instead of fighting. Raymond could not remember every lesson, but he remembered one sentence clearly. "A person who has mastered balance never needs to prove it." Watching Elias now stirred that memory with unsettling clarity. Raymond lowered his eyes again. He had no desire to witness whatever happened next. Near the control station, Correctional Officer Daniel Harper looked up from his clipboard after noticing that the usual flow of inmates had slowed to almost nothing. He had worked D-Block for nearly 9 years and had developed an instinct for unusual silence. Most conflicts announced themselves with shouting. The dangerous ones often arrived without any noise at all. Harper stepped away from the desk and looked toward the far end of the corridor. From where he stood, he could only see a cluster of inmates gathered near the shower entrance. Nothing appeared openly wrong, yet something about the stillness made him pause. Before deciding whether to investigate, another officer called his name from the opposite hallway to ask about a maintenance report. Harper turned for what he expected would be only a few seconds. Back at the shower entrance, Travis took one slow step closer. He was close enough now to notice details most people overlooked. The old man's prison shoes showed almost nowhere along the outer edges. His weight seemed perfectly centered despite standing on damp concrete. Even the towel resting beneath his left arm never slipped. It was as though every movement had been measured long before this morning ever began. Travis dismissed the thought with a grin. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. Elias answered without changing expression. "Many people have tried to explain that to me." Several inmates exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time since the encounter began, the laughter stopped completely. The corridor settled into another long silence. Somewhere overhead, an old ventilation fan groaned before beginning another slow rotation. Tiny drops of water rolled across the tile floor toward the drain between them. Nothing appeared to be happening, yet every person still watching felt the same quiet certainty. Whatever came next would not unfold the way anyone had expected. The quiet stretched so long that even the distant sounds of D Block seemed to disappear behind the steady rhythm of dripping water. Travis Coleman had spent years building a reputation by making other men uncomfortable, but standing across from Elias Washington produced a feeling he could not immediately explain. It was not fear. At least that was what he told himself. It was irritation. The old man refused to react according to the script that had worked on countless inmates before him. Most people either argued, apologized, or looked away. Elias did none of those things. He simply stood there as though time itself had slowed around him. Travis decided the silence had lasted long enough. "Tell me something," he said with another confident smile. "How does a man your age end up in a place like this?" The question floated through the hallway. A few younger inmates leaned closer, eager to hear the answer. Stories traveled quickly inside prison walls, yet almost nobody knew anything about the quiet newcomer beyond his name and age. Elias looked toward the shower door for a brief moment before answering. "Life takes people to places they never planned to visit." Travis laughed. "That is not an answer. Sometimes it is the only honest one," Elias replied. Again, there was no anger in his voice, no attempt to defend himself. Just calm words delivered with the same steady pace he had used from the moment he entered the corridor. The exchange left several inmates strangely disappointed. They had expected sharp insults or emotional outbursts. Instead, they found themselves listening to what sounded more like a conversation between two strangers waiting for a bus. Yet the lack of excitement somehow created even greater tension. Every passing second made the hallway feel smaller. Raymond Brewer remained against the concrete wall with his arms folded. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, but his ears missed nothing. He remembered hearing that same quiet cadence many years earlier when an elderly instructor visited a correctional education program in another state. The man had spoken about patience, explaining that true discipline often looked invisible to people searching only for loud displays of strength. Raymond never forgot those words because the instructor had demonstrated balance by standing perfectly still while everyone else around him kept shifting their weight without realizing it. Watching Elias now awakened the same memory with remarkable clarity. He still could not remember the instructor's name, but he remembered the feeling that settled over the room whenever the man spoke. It was the feeling that someone understood far more than he chose to reveal. A young inmate standing beside Raymond noticed the older man's uneasy expression. "Do you know him?" he whispered. Raymond answered after a long pause. "I know enough to stay where I am. He is just an old man." Raymond slowly shook his head. "That is what worries me." At the opposite end of the corridor, Officer Daniel Harper finally finished answering the maintenance question that had interrupted his routine. As he turned back toward the shower area, he immediately noticed that almost every inmate had stopped moving. Even those pretending to organize laundry carts seemed more interested in watching the hallway than completing their chores. Harper frowned. Years inside Blackstone had taught him that unusual silence deserved more attention than shouting. He began walking toward the gathering at an unhurried pace, careful not to escalate a situation that still appeared peaceful from a distance. Travis noticed the approaching officer, but did not seem concerned. Harper remained far enough away that there was still time to finish whatever little game he believed he was playing. "You know," Travis said, taking another slow step forward, "people survive around here by understanding who is in charge." Elias nodded once. "Leadership matters." The answer caught Travis slightly off guard. "So you agree with me?" "Leadership and control are not always the same thing," Elias said. Another quiet settled over the hallway. The words were respectful, yet they carried a meaning that lingered long after they were spoken. One member of Travis's group shifted uneasily, unable to explain why the conversation no longer felt entertaining. The older man never challenged anyone directly. He never raised his voice. Still, every response somehow redirected the moment without effort. Tiny details became increasingly difficult to ignore. Elias never glanced toward the exits. He never searched for help. His breathing never changed. Even the folded towel remained perfectly balanced beneath his left arm, as though it had become part of him. Travis studied him more carefully than before. For the first time, he wondered what kind of life could produce that level of composure. Then he dismissed the thought almost immediately. In his experience, appearances could be deceiving, but age was not. Standing before him was a 72-year-old inmate missing an arm. Whatever calm he displayed, Travis remained convinced that it could only be an act. Unfortunately for everyone watching, that assumption was about to shape every decision that followed. Officer Daniel Harper continued down the corridor, his boots producing steady echoes against the concrete floor. From a distance, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. No raised voices. No obvious struggle. Just a handful of inmates standing near the shower entrance, and several others pretending not to watch. Yet Harper had spent enough years inside Blackstone State Penitentiary to recognize that the quiet moments usually demanded the most attention. He slowed his pace, deciding to observe a little longer before stepping in. Travis Coleman noticed the officer approaching and flashed an easy smile toward his own crew. "Looks like we do not have much time," he said in a voice meant only for the men beside him. "Let us welcome our new neighbor properly before the hallway gets crowded." The younger inmates chuckled, eager to impress the man whose approval shaped almost every decision they made inside D Block. Most of them had arrived within the last 5 years. They knew Travis only as the man who always seemed to get his way. They had never experienced a moment when his confidence had been questioned. That history made them believe they were watching another ordinary morning. Raymond Brewer knew better. He quietly turned his shoulders farther away from the gathering, as though creating even the smallest distance might somehow separate him from whatever memory was beginning to surface. He remembered attending a correctional education seminar more than 2 decades earlier. An elderly guest instructor had visited the facility to speak about discipline, self-control, and conflict resolution. The instructor had demonstrated balance without raising his voice or making dramatic movements. Every correctional officer present had watched with genuine respect. Raymond could not remember every lesson, but one image remained perfectly clear. The instructor had stood with effortless posture while explaining that real mastery was measured by how little force a person needed, not how much. At the time, Raymond had dismissed the presentation as interesting but impractical. Prison life rewarded intimidation, not patience. Looking at Elias now, that old certainty no longer felt convincing. Travis folded his arms once more and studied the elderly man with growing curiosity. "You have been here a week," he said. "You keep your bunk clean. You never ask favors. You never complain about the food. You do not even look nervous. Either you are the calmest old man I have ever met, or you have not figured out where you are yet." Elias answered with the same measured tone. "Every place has rules. Some are written. Some are not." Travis nodded. "Exactly. And I make the unwritten ones." Elias held his gaze for a quiet moment before speaking again. Rules built on fear usually need to be repeated every day. One of the younger gang members frowned, trying to understand why such ordinary words sounded strangely unsettling. Travis forced another laugh, although it arrived half a second later than before. "You like talking in riddles?" Elias gently shook his head. "No, I simply choose my words carefully." The response lingered in the still air. Nobody interrupted. Nobody found another joke. Even the constant dripping from the shower pipes seemed louder than it had only moments earlier. Harper drew closer until he stood less than 30 feet away. He recognized Travis immediately, but focused most of his attention on the older inmate standing across from him. Harper had processed hundreds of new arrivals over the years. Most carried themselves with visible tension during their first month. Elias looked different. His breathing remained slow and even. His eyes stayed attentive without appearing restless. Harper quietly wondered how a 72-year-old man, missing an arm, could appear more comfortable than inmates 30 years younger. Behind Harper, another correctional officer called out that breakfast cleanup would begin in 10 minutes. Harper raised one hand to acknowledge the message but kept watching the hallway. Something told him that stepping in too early might create more problems than it solved. Meanwhile, Travis decided the conversation had lasted long enough. His reputation depended on certainty, and certainty became difficult to maintain whenever another man refused to play the role expected of him. He stepped slightly closer, leaving only a narrow space between himself and Elias. The younger inmates mirrored his movement without being told. The hallway seemed to shrink around them. Still, Elias did not retreat. His towel remained tucked neatly beneath his left arm. His feet rested naturally on the damp tile, neither rigid nor careless. He looked neither trapped nor defiant. He simply looked present, as though he accepted each passing moment exactly as it arrived. For reasons none of the younger inmates could explain, the confidence they had carried into the hallway began to fade. The old man had not threatened anyone. He had not argued. He had not even taken a single unnecessary step. Yet the atmosphere had shifted so completely that several men suddenly found themselves questioning assumptions they had considered obvious only minutes earlier. And without realizing it, Travis Coleman was preparing to make the first decision he would soon wish he had never made. Travis Coleman slowly smiled again, but this time the expression looked practiced rather than natural. He had learned long ago that authority inside D Block depended as much on appearances as on reputation. The moment other inmates sensed hesitation, questions began to spread faster than facts. He refused to let that happen. "You know what I think?" he asked, keeping his eyes fixed on Elias Washington. "I think you spent your whole life getting people to feel sorry for you." A few members of his crew laughed immediately, grateful for something familiar to react to. Travis continued before anyone else could speak. "An old man. One arm. Quiet voice. You probably expect everyone to step aside because life has already been hard enough." Elias listened without interrupting. His expression remained unchanged, neither offended nor amused. He simply allowed the words to exist without giving them any power. The silence after Travis finished felt unexpectedly heavy. Most inmates instinctively defended themselves when someone questioned their dignity. Elias did not. That absence of reaction proved strangely unsettling. Travis took another small step forward until barely 3 feet separated them. "You are different from the others," he said. "That makes people curious. Curiosity can be dangerous in here." Elias answered gently, "Only when it is guided by fear." Travis tilted his head. "You really believe you have everything figured out, do you not?" "No," Elias replied. "I stopped believing that many years ago." The answer confused several younger inmates standing nearby. They had expected stubborn pride, not humility. Somehow that made the old man even more difficult to understand. Behind them, Raymond Brewer quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment. Every calm response from Elias reminded him of lessons he had ignored decades earlier. The old instructor he once met had explained that arguments usually ended when one person refused to compete for the last word. At the time, Raymond thought the idea sounded unrealistic inside prison walls. Watching the conversation unfold now, he realized he might have misunderstood the lesson all those years ago. Officer Daniel Harper continued approaching at an unhurried pace, careful not to create unnecessary tension. He noticed something unusual about the body language of the inmates gathered near the shower entrance. Nobody appeared ready to leave, yet nobody seemed eager to move either. It was as if the entire hallway had settled into a strange waiting game. Harper glanced toward the security camera mounted near the ceiling. He knew its angle covered only part of the corridor. The shower entrance itself remained partly hidden behind a concrete support column, one of many blind spots that maintenance requests had failed to correct over the years. Travis casually reached toward the folded towel tucked beneath Elias's remaining arm. Instead of grabbing it, he lightly tapped one corner with the back of his fingers, causing it to shift slightly before Elias calmly adjusted it without visible irritation. The gesture itself was minor, almost playful, yet everyone understood its purpose. It was not about the towel. It was about testing boundaries. Elias looked down for only an instant before meeting Travis's eyes again. "Is that important to you?" he asked. Travis smiled. "Respect is important to me. Respect cannot be collected," Elias answered. "It can only be given." One of the younger gang members quietly muttered, "He talks like a professor." Another replied, "Or a preacher." Raymond whispered almost to himself, "Neither." The words escaped before he realized he had spoken aloud. The younger inmate beside him turned in surprise. "Then what is he?" Raymond hesitated for several seconds. "I'm not sure I want to know." Travis noticed the brief exchange down the hallway and frowned. The attention was beginning to drift away from him. That alone irritated him more than anything Elias had actually said. D Block had always operated according to a simple rule. Everyone watched Travis. Everyone reacted to Travis. This morning the old man had somehow changed that balance without making a single demand. Even Harper found himself studying Elias more carefully than the others. There was something remarkably disciplined about the elderly inmate's posture. He never appeared stiff. He never appeared careless. His weight seemed perfectly centered despite standing for so long on damp concrete, with only one arm free. Harper had seen that kind of effortless balance only a handful of times, usually among experienced athletes or military veterans during specialized training demonstrations. The observation lingered quietly in the officer's mind, although he could not yet explain why it mattered. Travis finally drew a slow breath and looked toward the shower entrance before returning his attention to Elias. "There is one simple way to settle this," he said with quiet confidence. "Walk away and find another shower. We will all forget this conversation ever happened." Several inmates waited for the old man to accept the offer. It sounded reasonable. It offered everyone an easy exit. Elias remained silent for a few moments before speaking in the same calm voice that had never once changed since entering the hallway. Running away from ordinary moments has a way of turning them into lifelong habits. The words settled over the corridor with unexpected weight. Nobody laughed. Nobody answered. Even Officer Harper stopped walking for a brief second, sensing that the quiet balance holding the hallway together had become increasingly fragile. The hallway remained frozen in an uneasy balance after Elias Washington finished speaking. Nobody rushed to answer him. Nobody stepped forward. The quiet itself had become part of the confrontation. Travis Coleman refused to let that silence linger any longer. He glanced toward one of the younger men standing beside him, a broad-shouldered inmate named Kyle Mercer who had spent the past year trying to earn a permanent place within the group. Kyle understood the look immediately. Without waiting for instructions, he walked forward with an exaggerated confidence that drew everyone's attention. "Maybe he just does not hear very well," Kyle said with a grin. "Maybe we should help him understand." Several members of the gang laughed again, relieved that someone had finally broken the uncomfortable stillness. Kyle stopped less than an arm's length from Elias and looked him up and down with open disbelief. "You really think you belong here?" he asked. "You are carrying yourself like somebody important." Elias answered as calmly as before. "Every person is important to someone." Kyle rolled his eyes. "That is not what I asked. It is the answer I chose." Another wave of quiet settled over the corridor. Even Travis noticed that the younger inmates were no longer laughing as naturally as they had at the beginning. Every attempt to shake the old man's composure seemed to disappear the moment it reached him. Kyle circled slowly, studying Elias from different angles, as though searching for some hidden weakness beyond the one everyone could already see. He paused briefly when he noticed the neatly pinned sleeve hanging where the old man's right arm had once been. "Life has not been very kind to you," Kyle said. Elias nodded once. "Life teaches every person differently." "And what did it teach you?" Kyle asked. Elias looked directly at him. "To pay attention before making decisions." The words sounded almost conversational, but Raymond Brewer felt a chill run across his shoulders. He remembered another sentence from that long-forgotten seminar years ago. The instructor had explained that the first mistake in any conflict was believing the other person had already revealed everything worth knowing. Raymond quietly lowered his head again. He wished the younger inmates had learned that lesson somewhere other than this hallway. Officer Daniel Harper continued watching from several yards away. He noticed that Kyle kept shifting his feet every few seconds while Elias remained almost perfectly balanced without visible effort. Harper had spent years supervising inmate recreation, and one detail suddenly stood out. The old man's weight never drifted backward, never leaned forward, and never settled unevenly despite standing on damp tile with only one arm free. It looked less like habit and more like lifelong training. Harper narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. Travis crossed his arms again. "Kyle," he called, "ask him one more time." Kyle smiled confidently. "Simple choice, old man. Walk away, use another shower, and everyone goes on with their morning." Elias looked toward the open doorway where the steady sound of running water continued echoing through the room beyond. Then he returned his attention to Kyle. "I have no reason to change my morning." Kyle sighed dramatically before shaking his head. "You really are stubborn." Elias gently smiled for the first time since entering the hallway. It was not a smile of victory or mockery. It carried the quiet warmth of someone remembering an old lesson. "No," he said softly. only consistent. The unexpected smile unsettled more people than an angry expression ever could have. It appeared completely genuine, untouched by the pressure surrounding him. Travis felt something unfamiliar creeping into the edges of his confidence. He could not explain why every exchange left him feeling as though he had fallen one step behind in a conversation he believed he controlled. Determined to reclaim the moment, he nodded toward Kyle once more. Kyle slowly extended one hand, intending only to nudge the folded towel from beneath Elias's arm and embarrass him in front of everyone watching. It seemed harmless enough to earn another round of laughter. The instant Kyle's fingertips moved closer, something changed that almost nobody could describe afterward. Elias did not flinch. He did not retreat. He merely shifted his footing by what looked like no more than an inch. The adjustment was so small that several inmates failed to notice it at all. Raymond did. Officer Harper did as well. Both men recognized that the old man's center of balance had quietly changed before anyone else had even completed a movement. Kyle hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second, puzzled by a feeling he had never experienced before. Standing that close to Elias, he suddenly felt as though the elderly inmate had somehow anticipated the moment long before it happened. Around them, every conversation throughout the corridor faded into complete silence. Even the inmates who had deliberately looked away now found themselves turning back toward the shower entrance. Without realizing it, every person in D Block had begun waiting for the same next moment. SUA, time seemed to slow the instant Kyle Mercer decided to finish the gesture he had already started. His fingertips moved toward the folded towel with complete confidence, expecting nothing more than another easy laugh from the men standing behind him. Instead, the hallway witnessed something so subtle that several inmates would later argue about what they had actually seen. Elias Washington did not step backward. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any sudden movement. He simply turned his body by a fraction, allowing his left foot to settle naturally against the damp tile while his shoulders rotated with effortless precision. The motion appeared almost too small to matter, yet the effect was immediate. Kyle instinctively reached a little farther than he intended, his own momentum carrying him forward after the point where his balance had already begun to disappear. Before anyone realized what had happened, he found himself taking 2 hurried steps to recover his footing. His hands stretched outward automatically to steady himself, and he stumbled harmlessly onto one knee before quickly catching himself against the nearby wall. There was no strike, no dramatic display, only an awkward loss of balance that made the entire hallway fall into stunned silence. Kyle looked back over his shoulder in complete confusion. He knew someone should have pushed him, yet he could not honestly say that anyone had. Elias remained standing exactly where he had been only moments earlier, his towel still resting securely beneath his remaining arm, his breathing unchanged. Travis Coleman's smile slowly faded. He glanced toward the other members of his crew, expecting someone to laugh the incident away, but none of them did. They had all been watching closely. They had expected embarrassment for the elderly inmate. Instead, they had watched one of their own lose balance without understanding how. Officer Daniel Harper stopped walking entirely. Years of supervising inmate activity had sharpened his eye for movement, and something about what he had just witnessed immediately caught his attention. It had not resembled panic. It had not resembled luck. The old man's adjustment had occurred before Kyle fully committed to his own motion, almost as though Elias had quietly redirected the situation without opposing it. Harper narrowed his eyes, replaying the sequence in his mind. Raymond Brewer finally lifted his head. The expression on his weathered face was not surprise. It was recognition. A memory buried beneath decades of prison life suddenly returned with startling clarity. He remembered the elderly instructor standing inside a correctional gymnasium many years ago, calmly demonstrating how the human body naturally followed its own momentum when guided instead of resisted. The instructor had repeated one sentence several times that afternoon. Balance is borrowed before it is lost. Raymond had never understood those words until now. Across the hallway, whispers quietly spread among inmates who had not seen the movement clearly. "Did you catch that?" one asked. Another slowly shook his head. "I did not see him do anything." "Exactly," came the uncertain reply. Kyle stood again, brushing moisture from one knee while trying to protect what remained of his pride. His face reddened with embarrassment rather than pain. "Floor is slippery," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Nobody answered him. Even his closest friends seemed more interested in studying Elias than offering support. The old man looked at Kyle with quiet kindness instead of satisfaction. "Slow down," he said gently. "Your feet are trying to arrive before your thoughts." The advice sounded sincere, almost fatherly. That made it infinitely harder for Kyle to dismiss. Travis immediately stepped forward, determined to regain control of the moment before uncertainty spread any farther. "Enough games," he said. "Nobody loses balance from standing still." Elias calmly met his eyes. "Everyone does, eventually." Another heavy silence settled over D Block. Water continued running somewhere inside the shower room, while the old ventilation fan groaned overhead. Every familiar sound suddenly seemed distant compared to the quiet exchange unfolding in the corridor. Harper resumed walking, now closing the remaining distance much more deliberately. He no longer viewed the gathering as an ordinary prison dispute. Something unusual was unfolding before him, and he intended to understand exactly what it was. Meanwhile, Travis found himself studying Elias with a level of caution he had not intended to reveal. For the first time that morning, a question entered his mind that refused to leave. What if the quiet old man standing in front of him was not hiding fear at all, but experience far beyond anything anyone in D Block had imagined? Officer Daniel Harper finally reached the edge of the gathering and stopped without saying a word. His trained eyes moved from Travis Coleman to Kyle Mercer and then settled on Elias Washington. Nothing about the scene matched what he had expected. There were no raised fists, no shouting, no visible struggle. Yet every inmate in the hallway stood perfectly still, watching the elderly man with an attention Harper had never seen directed toward a newcomer. He had spent almost a decade inside Blackstone State Penitentiary, and one lesson had never failed him. When experienced inmates suddenly became quiet, there was always a reason. Harper looked toward Kyle. "Everything all right here?" Kyle answered too quickly. Floor was slick. Harper glanced down at the damp tile before looking back at Elias. "Did anyone get hurt?" Elias gave a small shake of his head. "No, officer." The calmness in his voice carried no trace of sarcasm or triumph. Harper nodded once, but he did not leave. Something continued pulling at the edge of his memory. He had seen movements like that before, not inside prison, but years earlier during a joint training seminar attended by correctional officers from several states. The guest instructor had been an elderly martial arts master invited to demonstrate methods of controlling conflict without relying on unnecessary force. Harper remembered being impressed by how ordinary the demonstrations appeared until someone tried to resist. The instructor had repeated one phrase throughout the session: "Control begins before contact." Harper had dismissed the seminar as interesting but unlikely to matter inside a maximum security prison. Now, standing only a few feet from Elias Washington, those forgotten words suddenly returned with remarkable clarity. Travis noticed Harper's hesitation and forced another confident smile. "Everything is under control, officer. We were just talking." Harper answered without taking his eyes off Elias. "That is what concerns me." The hallway fell silent again. Raymond Brewer slowly stepped away from the wall for the first time since the encounter had begun. He studied Elias carefully before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "I knew I had seen that balance before." Several nearby inmates turned toward Raymond in surprise. He rarely volunteered opinions about anything. Travis frowned. "What are you talking about?" Raymond ignored him completely. His eyes remained fixed on Elias. "About 23 years ago, they brought a martial arts instructor into the federal facility where I was serving time. They said he had trained police departments, military instructors, and crisis response teams all over the country. They told us he could stop confrontations without looking like he was fighting." Harper slowly turned toward Raymond. "You remember his name?" Raymond hesitated, searching through memories buried beneath decades of prison life. Not at first. He studied Elias for another long moment before quietly continuing. "Washington." The name echoed softly through the corridor. Harper looked back at Elias with growing disbelief. "Elias Washington." Elias offered only a polite nod. Raymond continued, speaking almost to himself. "They called him one of the highest-ranked Aikido instructors ever to volunteer inside correctional programs. I remember because one of the officers kept saying the old man could teach balance better than anyone he had ever met." Several younger inmates exchanged uncertain glances. None of them had ever heard the word Aikido spoken inside Blackstone before. Travis tried to laugh, but the sound came out flat. "You expect me to believe this old man is some kind of famous teacher?" Harper answered before Elias could speak. "I remember that seminar now." His voice had become noticeably quieter. The instructor only demonstrated enough movement for people to understand principles. Half the room thought nothing had happened until they watched the recording afterward. Kyle stared at Elias with widening eyes. "You mean?" Harper slowly nodded. "If I am remembering correctly, he spent decades teaching people how to avoid unnecessary conflict by using timing, balance, and positioning instead of strength." Every eye in the hallway returned to Elias. The elderly man neither confirmed nor denied the growing realization around him. He simply adjusted the folded towel beneath his arm and stood with the same quiet posture he had maintained all morning. Finally, he spoke. "Those lessons belong to another chapter of my life." Harper looked at him with genuine respect, replacing professional curiosity. "You never mentioned any of that during intake." Elias smiled gently. "Nobody asked." The answer settled over D Block with greater force than any dramatic revelation could have carried. In that single moment, the image everyone had formed of the quiet, elderly inmate disappeared. He was no longer simply an aging man with one arm who had wandered into the wrong hallway. Without raising his voice, without boasting, and without harming anyone, Elias Washington had become the one person inside Blackstone whom nobody would ever underestimate again. The hallway remained silent long after the truth settled over everyone who had witnessed the morning unfold. Nobody hurried toward the showers. Nobody rushed to continue breakfast cleanup. Even the usual rhythm of prison life seemed to pause as each inmate quietly reconsidered the assumptions they had made only minutes earlier. Travis Coleman stood motionless, his confidence replaced by something he had rarely experienced inside D Block: uncertainty. He searched Elias Washington's face for any sign of satisfaction, expecting at least a small smile of victory after the remarkable revelation. He found none. The elderly man simply inclined his head politely toward Officer Daniel Harper before walking through the shower entrance with the same calm pace he had shown from the beginning. He neither celebrated nor looked back. The sound of running water gradually blended once again with the steady hum of the ventilation system, leaving everyone else standing exactly where they were. Kyle Mercer quietly exhaled and looked toward Travis as though waiting for instructions. None came. For the first time since joining the group, Kyle realized that reputation alone could not answer every question. Raymond Brewer slowly smiled to himself. It was a small, tired smile earned through decades of hard lessons. "I told you not to watch," he murmured softly to the younger inmate beside him. "Some people only look ordinary until you finally learn what ordinary really means." The younger man remained speechless. Harper watched Elias disappear beyond the doorway before turning toward Travis. His voice remained professional, but noticeably firmer than before. "Morning recreation is over. Everyone returns to schedule." Nobody argued. The inmates quietly dispersed in different directions, speaking only in whispers once enough distance separated them from the shower entrance. By lunchtime, the story had already traveled through every housing unit inside Blackstone State Penitentiary. Some versions claimed the old man had moved faster than anyone could see. Others insisted he had never moved at all. A few inmates argued that Officer Harper had personally confirmed the identity of a legendary instructor who had trained law enforcement agencies across the country. As always inside prison walls, every retelling grew a little larger than the last. Yet one detail remained exactly the same in every version. Nobody described Elias Washington as weak anymore. Over the following days, an unexpected change settled across D Block. The usual noise surrounding Elias quietly disappeared. Meal lines opened without argument whenever he approached. Empty seats somehow became available before he reached the cafeteria tables. Men who had ignored him during his first week now greeted him with respectful nods. Elias responded to every gesture exactly the same way. A calm smile. A quiet greeting. Nothing more. He accepted no special treatment and asked for no favors. His routine never changed. He read borrowed library books during recreation periods, folded every blanket with precise care, and spent long evenings sitting near the narrow window of his cell watching sunlight fade across the prison yard. Harper found himself observing the elderly inmate more often than he intended. Curiosity eventually led him to request access to older administrative records that had not been included in the standard intake summary. Late one afternoon, after finishing paperwork, he entered the records office and located a storage cabinet containing archive transfer documents. Inside a thick manila folder marked with Elias Washington's name rested several sealed pages attached to correspondence from another correctional system nearly 15 years earlier. Harper carefully opened the file. His eyes moved across line after line of official reports describing educational programs, conflict resolution workshops, and commendations written by wardens who praised Elias for preventing confrontations without creating new ones. Then Harper reached the final document. Unlike the others, this page carried a bold authorization stamp restricting routine distribution. The first paragraph immediately caught his attention. It stated that before his incarceration, Elias Washington had not only earned international recognition as an Aikido Grandmaster, but had also quietly advised specialized training programs whose participants were never publicly identified. Several names listed beneath the report had been permanently redacted. Entire sections remained blacked out. Harper slowly looked back toward the corridor outside the records office, his expression changing as one final realization settled over him. The quiet old man now living inside D Block had revealed only the smallest fraction of his past. Whatever story had brought Elias Washington to Blackstone State Penitentiary remained buried far deeper than anyone had imagined. And Harper suddenly understood that the greatest mystery inside the prison had never been how the elderly inmate carried himself with such extraordinary composure. The real mystery was why a man with a life that remarkable had arrived behind those walls in the first place.